It is the biggest child sex abuse scandal in the history of our country.
We can't possibly know the full truth, because if we did, there'd be some kind of riot.
Media failure, we have police failure, we have local council failure, we have politicians failure.
If they acknowledge this stuff, and they were to acknowledge the problems that we've got here, they would have to acknowledge that their ideology was wrong, and they made mistakes that set Britain on an irreversible course.
As far as the media are concerned, what is in the mindset?
For them, the bigger headline would be Starmer versus Musk. They are putting a narrative out there. Now, they might say, oh, we're completely neutral. They're not.
For all his ills, I think it's pretty hard to argue that before Elon Musk, no one has brought more attention to this than Toby Robertson.
I think his role on exposing the grooming gangs has been absolutely massive. Huge.
Why do you think Keir Starmer would want to block this?
How do I phrase this?
Before we hear from Patrick Christys, I ask, if you want to support the show, all you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Patrick discussing the issues that you want to hear about and that the mainstream media won't touch. But without further ado, Patrick Christys. Patrick Christys, thank you so much for joining me on the show. It's to discuss a difficult topic, one that you as a broadcaster at GB News have been covering with quite some courage, I'd say, and you've had some slack and some flack for doing so. It's, of course, the rape gangs scandal, which is now a huge story. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. It's been a long time coming, this. I'm looking forward to it.
So, of course, there's so much we could talk about, and it's a huge sort of edifice of disgrace, really. It's a very complex issue. I specifically wanted to talk to you about the media and the history of the media's role in the rape gang scandal, not just what's been going on to date. For example, at Keir Starmer's first press conference, it was actually about the NHS, but the first time he took questions about the rape gangs. There were 3 questions from the press about Elon Musk, before any about the rape gangs, which for me is astounding on many levels. So we're going to come to that. But I think before we go into the media, and then we'd like to talk about what's going on in Parliament, Jess Phillips, this is a Labour reaction, Keir Starmer's reaction, but I think it's worth for people who are maybe new to the topic to kind of give a brief outline of this huge scandal. So, stop me and colour this in at any point you think there's more detail needed. But for decades, young British girls have been raped, tortured, abused, and in some cases, the case of Lucy Lowe, Laura Wilson, Victoria Goglia, Charlene Downs, and others brutally murdered. This has predominantly been carried out by Pakistani gangs up and down the country, as GB News have shown, in about 50 towns and cities up and down the country. It is, I would say, the biggest sex abuse scandal, certainly child sex abuse scandal in the history of our country. And it's horrific. It's been going on for a long time. Now, we can go into maybe the reasons for that, how it's come about, the various ideologies at play, utopian ideologies at play of multiculturalism, of mass migration, about how it's all come about. There's perhaps that's the sort of frieze that ties all the pillars together for this edifice. But along the way, then we have media failure, we have police failure, we have local council failure, we have politicians failure, we have I would say failures of consecutive prime ministers, including Sir Keir Starmer, although I'd like to get into Starmer himself and what his failures might be. There's counter side stories as well about how the so-called far right, and according to Keir Starmer in his press conference, anyone who wants an inquiry is far right. So maybe we talk about who is actually the far right and who is not. And that's certainly part of the dialogue, whether or not you disagree with it. That's a sort of side story. And then Elon Musk has made this world news. Why? Well, it started with a story. It started with an issue on X. Fraser Nelson had written something about migration into Britain. And I think Reform UK MP Rupert Lowe chimed in with details of the 2014 Mohammed Karar trial. Sorry, that was June 2013. And then the 2014 Alexis J report, which had some very graphic details of the some of the horrors and torture of certain girls. So that's kind of a brief outline, I think, for people not used to this story. Now, is there anything you'd add to that? How have you come into this story? When did this first come across your table?
For me, it was years ago when the Rochdale and Rotherham grooming gang scandal initially broke, and it was actually a expose brought to light by Labour MP Sarah Champion, who, to tie into some of the things that you've just said there, I am convinced was told to shut up about it, because she went big on it and then it all went very quiet. And it went very quiet, in my view, because Labour realised that they had a lot of votes in the Pakistani communities at the time and they didn't want to rock the boat. And I think they also realised that in the Labour councils up and down the country, in the 50 towns that this happened, at least 50 towns, the overwhelming majority of them were Labour councils, and the overwhelming majority of them had some form of failure by Labour councillors at that time. So it all went very quiet. But that was my first head turn to this. And then very early on, I realised that this was being silenced and suppressed, not just because of people like Sarah Champion essentially being told to shut up and go away.
So just for detail, Sarah Champion, she was part of Jeremy Corbyn's shadow Labour cabinet, and she wrote an article in The Sun specifically saying that there's a problem of Pakistani gangs raping young white girls up and down the country.
Absolutely, 100%.
And she was made to resign.
Well, she was completely silenced by it, completely marginalised, and has been quite quiet on it since, on and off, But what I noticed immediately was two things, which was the lack of appetite from mainstream media to cover this story, and also the perception that if you did cover it, you were now an Islamophobe. Now, both of those things I find are absolutely ridiculous. And the trade-off that was made there was that for people in the establishment media and for people in politics and for people on the left, they were happy for vulnerable young working-class white girls to be raped, tortured and murdered at the hands of predominantly Pakistani men, as long as it didn't upset the apple cart of multiculturalism, diversity and, crucially, votes. And that was a big, big problem for me. There was no courage and no insight there from the media or from the political class at all. And as a result of this, it's a problem that, seemingly started in the 90s. I suspect it probably happened earlier than that, and was allowed to run and run and run and run and run for decades. And we see it time and time again, Winston, don't we? We can't possibly know the full truth, because if we did, there'd be some kind of riot. Well, I would argue that what you should be doing there is stopping the problem, not worrying about whether or not there's a riot. Not trying to cover that up. If there's a problem so big that it might lead to people rioting on the streets, maybe you should care more about stopping that problem. Yeah,
absolutely. In fact, there were riots. I would argue, although it's perhaps it's speculative, that the riots of August 2024 last year were part of the spirit that animated those riots was this scandal. But more explicitly, the Knowsley riots at the beginning of 2023, February 2023, was because outside an asylum hotel in Knowsley, Liverpool, there had been one of the men staying there had been videoed specifically making a pass at a young teenage girl, and that video went viral, and the police failed to do anything about it. And there weren't riots until after the police had failed. So there are cases where that's exactly.
But this is it, time and time again, and you've hit the nail on the head there, which is that the British public are actually a very tolerant, generous lot. We absolutely are. But what we don't like is systematic failure. And you make the point there. Why are people so angry? Why are people so enraged? Why do people sometimes feel the personal need to go outside and voice their discontent? Well, it's because they feel systematically let down. When you're backed into a corner and you feel as though nobody is listening to you and things are being covered up and you're being gaslit into being told that this isn't a problem, at some point, you're going to put your foot down. Again, the fact that there is unrest, and I'm not justifying anyone setting fire to a migrant hotel, certainly not, but the fact that there is unrest is a symbol that the state and the authorities have failed, because this wasn't over nothing. These things aren't over nothing. And there's also been the demonisation of it. So there was the case of the Bedreddin brothers, which was part of a Syrian grooming gang, Syrian refugees who arrived and were plonked in the Newcastle area. And there was a protest there by, I suppose you might call it a so-called Patriots March.
When was this?
This was back in about 2016.
Okay.
And the people who were on that march were demonised, far right, you are all racists, all of this stuff. And then it turned out that the Bedreddin brothers had been part of a rape gang that had been abusing and torturing young girls, and that had actually happened. And so, whilst some people who might have gone on that march might have expressed, outdated views or racist views or whatever, that it turned out that at the core, they were right to be very worried and very angry about the scale of asylum seekers, so-called, and the potential crimes and the potential risks that could cause. And at that core, they were right to feel that way, and they were demonized about that. And unfortunately, they were proved to be correct.
We should come to, I'd like to ask, I think for people who are new, just some of the ideologies at play that have led to this. And it's not just the media who have behaved very bizarrely for decades on this, but politicians as well, the whole entire system. I think it starts with partly the ideology of open borders, mass migration not being a problem, that all cultures are equal. I don't think that's the case, that all cultures are equal. And then you have a term that often comes up is community cohesion. It's prioritizing of community cohesion rather than protecting the most vulnerable people in society. I think you've alluded to this already. If you want community cohesion, protect the most vulnerable people in society. Had they done that, then there would be more community cohesion. This is blown out because they haven't done that. And by they, I mean the authorities. And then I think it's political correctness then, from then on out. It's a utopia of multicultural Britain without talking about what unifies us, about integrating newcomers. It's kind of a hot mess of progressive ideology all on top of each other.
It all falls down at the first hurdle, because there are communities that don't want to integrate. There are communities that do not want to integrate, and they are dotted right around the country, and they are predominantly British Pakistani or at times maybe British Bangladeshi communities who have, in my view, absolutely no desire to integrate. That is why we are seeing 85 Sharia courts in Britain. We are the Western capital for Sharia courts, which is an absolute disgrace. So we're seeing that. If you go to places like Oldham or parts of Rochdale or vast way, Blackburn is a great example of it. Huge parts of Birmingham, Tower Hamlets in London. Can you tell me and give me a real, proper, serious cast-iron example of any serious attempt at integration from aspects of the Muslim community in those areas? I don't think they do want to integrate a lot of the time.
I mean, maybe you have evidence of that, but let's say it's speculative. We can't tell whether or not they want to. The fact is, if you have mass migration, you can't integrate because they're immigrating coming here on such a scale that they're not actually face to face with locals, because whole new communities are coming up and they're not really interacting at all. So it's, even if they wanted to integrate, the means and speed of migration means it's very difficult for them to do so.
Yeah, and we've not incentivized integration whatsoever. So we are more than happy to dish out benefits to people who can't speak English. We spent £27 million last year on interpreters at the Department for Work and Pensions for people who were trying to claim benefits who obviously couldn't speak English. So there seems to be zero attempts really to enforce the learning of the English language on people who want to come and live here and spend their lives here and in times literally live off the state in order to do so. So language is important, and we are not enforcing that. And anecdotally, I was very aware of this from when I was still at school. Where I went to school in Manchester was right on a strip which is affectionately known as the Curry Mile in Rusholme, Greater Manchester. And there was a primary school down the road. And we used to do things for Duke of Edinburgh Award, like we'd go and teach reading to some of the kids at that school. And there was about 2 white kids in the whole school, and the reading age there for children that were 10 years old, so they were going into the next phase of their state education the next year when they were starting secondary school at the age of 11. And those 10-year-olds there had a reading age of like a 4 or a 5-year-old. And you have to ask why that is. Well, I'll tell you why. It's because they don't speak English at home. And they obviously don't speak English in their wider society. And that is a problem. So there's no integration there. And that means that the first and second generations here also, I would argue, struggle to integrate. But to touch on your point there about why this isn't picked up on, well, you're right, because a lot of the left wing, and it includes the media in this, it massively includes the media in this, but also left-wing politicians, if they acknowledge this stuff and they were to acknowledge the problems that we've got here, they would have to acknowledge that their ideology was wrong and they made mistakes that set Britain on an irreversible course.
Yeah.
And we are now, there was a time when we could have fixed this. I think there was a time when we could have fixed this. And now I think that ship has sailed. We have to look at what we've got now and try to consolidate what we've got now and try to see what we do going forward. But there's going to be absolutely massive pushback to that. And people have to have broad shoulders if they want to stand up to it. But that was why it was allowed to happen, because in order to have stopped that, or in order to have raised the issue, they would have had to have admitted that their ideology was wrong. And they can't do that.
That's very interesting. There's two aspects of that. It's that they are complicit. And that they would have to completely deconstruct and reconstruct their entire worldview. And, I mean, we can come back to Labour, but there's some evidence that Labour really are. Simon Dankzuk was on GB News. Was he on your show?
Absolutely, yeah.
Former Labour MP, I think for Rotherham.
Rochdale,
and said that he was told by another Labour MP, Jim Dobbin, when Dankzuk learnt about the grooming gangs, don't mention the ethnicity, it would affect the Labour vote. He was also told by Chairman of the Parliamentary Labour Party, Tony Lloyd, ethnicity has no part in it. So there's we know what happened to Anne Cryer. Anne Cryer was the first person to bring this up, I think in 2003. She was a Labour MP, and she was completely vilified and called a racist and Islamophobe, just as you've suggested there. So we'll come back to the Labour history. I don't think the Tories have shrouded themselves in glory on this issue whatsoever. But let's get into the media aspect.
Yep.
So, as I mentioned, when Starmer took his first press conference, it was a press conference about the NHS, but he took questions about this for the first time. There were 3 questions about Elon Musk. Now, Elon Musk is an important part of this whole story. We've been talking about this. I've been talking about in my work for years. You've been talking about it for years. But Elon Musk has made it a global story. And for that, I am grateful, incredibly grateful. It's been frustrating that it's not been a global story.
The dam's burst now because of Elon Musk.
Yeah. Now, there's other aspects of what he's been saying that maybe we can see whether he's gone too far or not, but we'll get that. We'll get to that. As far as the media are concerned, people like Beth Rigby at Sky News and others asking questions, it's not for them. The rape gangs, they're like, I don't even understand how they would get to a point where one question's been asked about Musk. Okay, Musk's been asked. I'll ask about the rape gangs. No. I want to ask another question about Musk. Oh, those 2 asked about Musk. Or maybe I should ask about the rape gangs. No. One more about Musk. Quite literally 3 questions before your colleague, is it Christopher Hope at GB News, asked the first question about the rape gangs. So what is in the mindset? Do you have an insight into the mindset of the...
Yeah, I think 2 things. They can't actually bring themselves... They realise now that the term grooming gangs is possibly outdated and the actual term is Pakistani rape gangs. And I don't think they want to be seen ever to use that phrase. So that then hinders the kind of question that they can ask. The second thing is, a lot of the media, a lot of the establishment media have this almost like big world headline view, right? And for them, the bigger headline would be Starmer versus Musk, as opposed to working class white girls being raped on an industrial scale by predominantly British Pakistani men or just Pakistani men. And so they're looking for that big global headline. And whereas us here at GB News, we are focused primarily, as the clue is in the name, on what's going on in Great Britain and the people who are here, British citizens, and the issues for them, especially in this case when it comes to the working class, especially in this case when it comes to a lot of northern towns. So they would be afraid of using the phrase Pakistani grooming gangs, and they would be so focused on that big global headline that they neglect their base audience there. The other aspect to it,
but
I'm absolutely convinced, by the way, that all of them voted for Keir Starmer. That's the other problem. I'm absolutely convinced that so many people who work for Sky News, BBC, ITV, Channel 4 voted for Keir Starmer. Yeah. So, you've got people questioning them there, about this that actually I think, would probably quite happily leave their jobs and go and work for the Labour Party.
Well, I this is a tangent, but I want to ask about that because it's something I've been thinking about. It's clear to me that they vote for them. Some of them are effectively shilling for them, sometimes quite explicitly. I remember when Andrew Marr went on. Was it Andrew Marr went on Question Time shortly after the election and said, there's a relief in Britain.
Economic boom. We're going to have an economic boom.
Yeah, it seems weird to me. Now, I think it would be fair to say that the same is on the other side but is there really such thing as a journalist that is not partisan, that doesn't have... All humans have bias, right? So what's happening in America more and more is that a lot of the journalists, particularly independents, are kind of a bit more explicit about who they would vote for and support. And even if they say, I'm not going to vote, they're saying it. Is media now still in an old...
What I would argue about this, right, is that, so I do monologues twice a day, every single day, Monday to Friday on GB News. And everyone knows my views. I come on shows like this, more than happy to talk about my views. Don't try and hide anything. I would argue that what the BBC and Channel 4 and Sky News and ITV try to do is hide their views. And that's actually quite dangerous because you see it in more subtle ways. So their presentation, for example, of the pro-Palestine brigade, or their presentation of grooming gangs, or their presentation of things like the Channel migrant crisis, what they'll do is, instead of maybe running a story about, this stuff that we're talking about, they might run a story about how, there's been a poor refugee child and her mum and dad who they can't find social housing. Now, they will say, well, there's no bias in that story. That is a news story. But you can tell there's a bias because of what they're not covering. They have set that news agenda there, and that is the subtle indoctrination of the masses. Because until recently, Sky News, and still now, though, BBC News, and that's by virtue of it being on literally Channel 1 or ITV being on Channel 3 or Channel 4 being on Channel 4, right there in front of your TV, says, they are sitting on a massive audience. They have a huge audience. And if they are just pumping out what I can see through, and I think now increasingly more and more people can see through, as politically motivated content, like interviewing someone on the NHS traditional winter issues that they have there, and not telling you that doctor that they've interviewed is actually also a Labour Party councillor, which happens all the time on the BBC, all the time. They are putting a narrative out there. Now, they might say, oh, we're completely neutral. They're not. And that means, as far as I'm concerned, it's fair game for me to come out and dish out whatever I think, because they're not neutral. They're not. But what I would say is I'm more honest about it. I sit here, I don't care, I say what I think. They're trying to hide, and I think there's something really sinister about that, and it is indoctrination. I'll come back to that word again. It's indoctrination, because with the best will in the world, for your normal man and woman who just have other jobs, work in accounts somewhere or do whatever, they just turn on the news, they don't necessarily think that critically about it, because it's just an hour of their day where they turn on the news. So they swallow this stuff. And I think that's really damaging for society. Yeah.
Now, I think it's worth making a case that there have been some journalists in the mainstream media who have had the courage to speak up. Famously, Andrew Norfolk in 2011, there's a very, very shocking speech he made that you can find. Maybe I'll put a link to it for viewers, describing how he got involved in this story. Sue Reed, 2010. Julie Bindel was the first to report on it in 2006. There have been films made across several of these channels, and included by Trevor Phillips, actually. And so there have been some people. Now, a lot of these people are completely vilified for speaking out, and it's why they speak for a bit and then they kind of keep quiet a little bit. Do you think that let's say left-wingers listening, and I'm sure there aren't many, might say, well, actually, no, there has been some reportage on this issue. There's been some serious covering.
There has been, but there's been a smattering of it, hasn't there? And then it's all gone away. And I think that's, in a sense, quite offensive, because it's like a token gesture. I mean, if you just look at what Channel 4 did last night, Channel 4 last night put out a documentary on fake grooming gangs. So they might say that Trevor Phillips, who you referred to there, I believe was working for Channel 4 at the time, when he did a fascinating report on ideologies and attitudes in the British Muslim community, which did highlight the very, very troubling trends. So, whether it's a bent towards extremism in certain parts of it, attitudes towards women, or all of that stuff, okay? So they might say, well, look, years ago, we did do this with Trevor Phillips. Okay, and that was great. But then it all went away, didn't it? And then last night, right in the heart of the biggest conversation that Britain has ever had about grooming gangs, they put out a documentary about a fake grooming gang scandal.
It's unbelievable bad taste. The bad taste doesn't even do justice to how disgraceful that is. I mean, even though they were planning to do it, and I don't really want to be fair to them on this, but they weren't to know that this would become a global story now. And perhaps there's a time and a place to discuss the issue of people making fake stories, of course. But surely you say, you know what, this is not appropriate time, we'll put on something else.
I wonder if they thought, and they will probably deny this, that it wasn't appropriate time for it. That maybe that points towards the fact that nobody in that newsroom, or making the decisions anyway, felt as though the actual grooming gang scandal is as serious, or Pakistani rape gang scandal is as serious as you and I might think it. Because if we'd have been in that newsroom, there is no way that documentary would have gone out at that time.
Absolutely. No way. There's another sort of little pizza slice of the mainstream media. I'm not sure that you call them mainstream, but probably you would. And it's the sort of centrist dad circle jerk of Emily Maitlis, Sopel, Lewis Goodall, Rory Stewart, Alistair Campbell. Rory Stewart, when this whole thing blew up, they put out an episode about Elon Musk being a fascist. They didn't mention the rape gangs once. Of all those 5 people I've mentioned, I searched their Twitter history, never ever tweeted about grooming gangs before this year, before this specific story has come up. And as I said earlier, I think this is the biggest sex scandal in our abuse of children scandal in our nation's history. I don't quite understand how you can hold your head up high as a journalist and not have touched this.
So what does that tell you, right? So that tells you that they feel as though A, it might not be a big story, B, that it's not nice to talk about it in the kind of company that they keep. And I'm convinced that the vast majority of them are on the same dinner party circuit and go to very similar parties and have that similar kind of high society status there. So they obviously they wouldn't want to say anything that might rock the boat there. I also think there's something that goes further beyond that. If that kind of conversation is not being had around dinner tables at those dinner parties, there's a lot of very powerful people in those rooms. You know, Emily Maitlis got a huge amount of sway when it comes to the media. You know, John Sopel's had a career. You look at the likes of Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart, for example. If they're not talking about it in private company, and some of those, very often those kind of people, have been the people making decisions about what runs on news agendas. So whether it's on the national news, both in terms of print and in terms of broadcast as well. Mm-hmm. Those are the kind of people they hang out with are the executive editors of all of these programs, of news nights, of all of that. If they don't think that's a big issue and they don't want to talk about that, that is why it's not getting on the telly, and that's why it's not being broadcast out there. And you can tell a lot about that silence. I for the life of me cannot understand why groups like the news agents don't cover this. I can't understand it. And I think part of it might be a class issue. I think that I've looked at quite a lot of their output, or certainly when they were covering things like Brexit, where they'd go to parts of the UK that voted for Brexit in big numbers, and they'd find your white van man or man on street outside a gambling shop at midday on a Wednesday somewhere. And they'd ask some questions and they'd make them look a bit silly. Yeah. Or they'd clip it up and they'd make them sound like an idiot for just having a view, actually, which is that I want to leave the European Union. And that was a predominantly working class issue, I felt. And I think if you look at the victims in the grooming gang scandal, they're predominantly working class, young white girls from quite disadvantaged and in many cases very troubled backgrounds. And I just do not think that they A, empathise with that, or B, treat them with the same level of respect. That if there had been a grooming gang at St. Paul's Girls' School or at Eton or somewhere like that, they'd be all over this. But it's not, because it's girls from Rochdale or Oldham. Yeah. And that's a problem for me.
I actually experienced that firsthand. I covered the Reform Party rally before the general election at the Birmingham NEC, and the Times radio team were on the train up. It was me and Will, my producer you've just met, just the two of us, and we did a vox pop and then an interview with Nigel Farage. And it turned out that Times Radio did exactly the same thing, vox pop and an interview with Nigel Farage. Now, if you compare those two videos online, what they did afterwards, firstly, they asked a question about Nigel Farage. It's just the public don't care. They were trying to I think it was something to do with Russia or trying to make it look like a Putin apologist. Anyway, And they actually put on top of the YouTube video, over the interviews of the good and I would say very intelligent people who were at that conference, they put a really ominous sort of fascistic music to make it seem like this was some sort of Nazi rally. And it reflects in the numbers. Our video did something like 190, 200,000 views. Theirs did like 18,000. Because the people are like, what if you just humiliate people like this, or you're trying to paint them as not true? People are going to not trust you anymore.
Yeah.
So it's astonishing to me that people still, and they do listen to like the rest of politics news agents are the biggest podcast shows in the country. I think
it won't carry on though because they keep being wrong about stuff. It won't carry on because they continue to be wrong about things, and they are too arrogant or possibly stupid to acknowledge that. I mean, the US presidential election is the most recent example of it. Their lack of coverage on grooming gangs now is another one. And I think people see through it. For a long period of time, there was a view in media, as there has been in politics, that you need to occupy the centre to centre left ground in order to be at your most popular. And I think that is massively shifting. I think that the numbers of people in that squishy, lovey metropolitan elite is much smaller than the average man and woman out there on the street in towns and cities right across the country. And that is the market I want to tap into, mainly because I feel like I am that market. Yeah. That's me, really. And that's most of the people I hang out with. So I'd like us to feel represented in that view. And I think they're going to get a wake-up call when it comes to viewing figures going forward. Yeah. About, they might think that they are doing the Lord's work by echoing the views of people around Hampstead. But actually, there's not that many people that live in Hampstead when you compare that to the rest of the country.
Yeah. Well, I one thing that I found almost, it's like an open goal for this show is I don't necessarily have to be the best. I just have to cover the bloody stories because they're not touching them. And I suspect you also happen to be a great broadcaster at GB News.
I get what you mean there. You're right. Hit the stories, hit the topics.
A quick interruption to your show. If you would like exclusive content, exclusive interviews, and exclusive videos, come over to the Winston Marshall Substack. It's at winstonmarshall.co.uk, and there you can interact with me directly. It's winstonmarshall.co.uk, and you'll find links in the comments below. But back to the interview. Now, we can't talk about the sort of media and the journalism and the reporting of the grooming gangs without discussing Tommy Robinson, because the open goal that the media left was filled by Tommy Robinson, and for all his ills, I think it's pretty hard to argue that before Elon Musk, no one has brought more attention to the rape gang scandal than him. What's your take on his role in this?
I think his role on exposing the grooming gangs has been absolutely massive, huge. And he's taken a huge amount of flack for it, and he's been vilified for it. And unfortunately, because of his problematic past, I think you could say, because of his problematic past, when Tommy Robinson was talking about this, it was, and by the way, I'm not saying this is his fault, I'm saying it's a fault of everyone else. When he was talking about it, it then became quite easy for the chattering classes to go, this is just a Tommy Robinson issue. By the way, Keir Starmer just did that. Keir Starmer literally just did that. He said, you're jumping on a far-right bandwagon. And so that was...
For asking for an inquiry.
into industrial levels of rape gangs, etc. So for people's views on Tommy Robinson, whatever they may be, he was right about this. And that's important. Let's just look at the main issue at play in the UK right now, and it's Pakistani rape gangs. Was he right about that? Yes, he was. And that's important, I think.
So I guess we should discuss Musk's involvement in this because he's brought this to global attention, again, filling the open goal that is many have been missed. Andrew Norfolk, I actually was on Newsagents discussing this, and he said he's unhappy about how the grooming gangs are now or the rape gangs is now being used as a political tool. He seemed like he was almost on the verge of tears. My immediate reaction, as I've already said, is thank God that this has now been given the attention, because maybe now we'll head towards ending it at last. But Musk has been tweeting pretty, it's shooting from the hip, and he's brought Jess Phillips. He's called Jess Phillips, the Labour safeguarding minister, I think he's called for her to resign, and has also said that she's a rape gang apologist. I mean, we need to talk about Jess Phillips. Yeah. Do you think Musk has gone overboard, or do you share my opinion that this is a good thing?
Oh, I massively share your opinion this is a good thing. It's absolutely a good thing, and we should be very grateful for all this talk as well that the left do about how billionaires are a terrible thing. Well, all right, I was taking the richest man in the world to expose on a global stage a problem predominantly affecting working class young white girls. So there's a certain irony there, I think. I'm very glad he's done it. Now, there's language that he uses. I mean, he's got FU money, right? So he doesn't have to worry about being sued, really. He doesn't have to worry about paying damages to people in a way that you and I, or the vast majority of people, would have to consider. So he can say things. Now, he might have gone a bit too far at times, a rape gang apologist. Okay? Well, I wouldn't have called it that. But what I would say is she's not doing anything about it now, is she? And what I saw last night, that was in the GB News office and on BBC, we have all the screens up, BBC, Sky News, ITV, they all went out at the same time, pretty much, which was Jess Phillips being sat down, interviewed by other women, I think, which is a context that I think is important. I'm going to come on to here. And it was all about her. And
the interviewers were all women.
The interviewers were all women, and Jess Phillips. And it was all about her and how, as a woman, she now feels incredibly vulnerable because Elon Musk has turned her life upside down. And I looked at that, and before people say, "Oh, I'm guilty here of toxic masculinity," this was actually something that was pointed out to me by my wife. So, she was the one who clocked this, as she so often does before I do. But and that to me seemed as though it was a bit of a women's loving about, like, oh gosh, what Elon Musk has done is he's put me in danger. Now, a couple of things on that. I don't want to see any politician in danger. I don't want to see any politician facing physical threats. I think the reason why Jess Phillips is getting a lot of stick is because she's not doing her job. And that's the main point. Yeah. And the killer question in this was eventually when it came was, have you actually spoken to any members of any victims of the old? And she went, no, but I plan to do so. Sorry, that should have been the first question, and the interview should not have moved on from there. And it should have been, why not? Why aren't you doing your job? How does Elon Musk tweets make you feel? And also, Jess Phillips has not exactly been shy in the past. I mean, her Twitter feed has been littered with her calling people pricks, telling people to F off. She's been pretty forthright in her things going forward. Again, I don't want to see her face any kind of physical threat whatsoever at all. I absolutely hate that. But she's fundamentally, for me, she is not doing her job, and she can't clutch her pearls and cry into a herbal tea over that. Yeah.
So I think this is just to colour this in for people new to, particularly American listeners, new to Jess Phillips. Jess Phillips is Labour's safeguarding minister. She, after Oldham Council had requested a government inquiry into what happened in the Oldham constituency regards the rape gangs, she kept them waiting for 4 months before saying, no, it needs to happen at council level. There had already been a Greater Manchester inquiry into this, published in 2022, and that found that, yes, young girls have been let down, but it didn't expose any sort of rape gang. Now, I think it seems obvious that you can't have the accused or those alleged to have been involved in a crime or wrongdoing involved in overseeing the inquiry into that crime. So that's what the people of Oldham, the victims of Oldham, wanted. And she said no. And I think it's about to be discussed in Parliament. People listening will already know to the answer to this, and we'll come to that. Whether there'll be a national inquiry, we'll come to that in a minute. So Jess Phillips has said that there won't be a government inquiry. There's a big question about inquiries. There have been a few inquiries that maybe we should also get to. Why has Elon Musk said she's a rape gang apologist? Well, there's also a famous, maybe I don't know this fully, maybe it's just as simple as that. Maybe that was all the detail he went off to say that. She famously was on Question Time a few years ago after the Cologne rape,
the mass rape, about 1,000 women, I think, on one night in New Year's Eve in Cologne, wasn't it?
Yeah, what year was that?
It would have been around 2016, 2017, because it must have been shortly after Angela Merkel opened the floodgates.
And she went on to Question Time and said that's like a Birmingham on a Saturday night or something like that. And I don't think she was. I'm not quite actually totally sure how I interpret what she's saying there.
Idiocy.
Yeah, yeah, perhaps. And she's also someone who's had trouble herself from her Muslim. It's not a Muslim majority, her constituency, but it's the largest group within her constituency.
Mm-hmm.
And she was given a lot of trouble from them in the July general election.
She nearly lost.
She nearly lost, and she was getting heckled when she was up on the rostrum. So she finds herself in a weird place. Why do you think? Do you think she's a rape gang apologist?
I don't just think she's a rape gang apologist. I think she's made excuses for things in the past where she didn't need to. I mean, for example, when the pro-Palestine stuff was kicking off and we had that night of the far-right riots that never happened, in her constituency, there was a group of Muslim lads on mopeds with balaclavas on a roundabout because they had apparently received some kind of WhatsApp or Telegram message that the far right were on the way. And Sky News had a reporter there, a couple of people there, and they were intimidating. They were chasing them down the street. They were like just flagrantly breaking the law as well. Later that night, a bloke got his head kicked in outside a pub by one of these people. And Jess Phillips, instead of basically saying like, you need to go home, this is criminality, this is ridiculous, you can't have this, basically justified it by saying, well, they thought the far right was turning up. Well, so that's an apology, isn't it? That's making an apology for bad behaviour. So, when she was speaking about Cologne, she says, oh, well, Birmingham looks a bit like that on a Saturday night. So whether or not she's an apologist for grooming gangs, I don't know. And she would obviously say she's not. Has she done everything that she possibly could at times, I think, to avoid the issue or to make excuses for the bad behaviour of other people? Yes, 100%. 100%. And now, crucially for her, she is in a position of power. She's recorded on record a few years ago, saying that the grooming gang issue, the rape gang issue, is going on still in every single town and city. So she's on record saying that. And now she holds the keys to the office that could do something about that. And she's chosen not to. So what is that then? Is that an apology for it? Is it? I don't know. Is it her majority now in her seat is something like 690, I think. It's a Rizzler paper of a majority. I would go as far as to say I would probably expect her to lose that next time round, the way that it's going. And she nearly lost to an overtly pro-Gaza candidate. So she is bang in trouble in that constituency if she is seen to be doing anything that could be perceived as targeting disproportionately the local Muslim community. And I'm sorry, but I don't think someone who's in that position is the correct person to be making a judgment on whether or not a full inquiry into Pakistani rape gangs should be taking place.
Mm-hmm. In the context of Labour MP Joe Cox being murdered by someone on the far right and Conservative MP Sir David Amess being murdered by an Islamist, it's fair to say that it would... I don't think it's crazy to me that she would be worried when someone with a following of 210 million followers on X is going to make these allegations, and the nation is very upset, and we saw what happened in August 2024. So in some senses, it's somewhat understandable that she would feel that way. Do you not think?
I absolutely think it's understandable that she would feel that way. I hope that she has the security around her, and I really hope and make it abundantly clear that nobody ever does anything to physically attack her or do anything along those lines whatsoever. It's unacceptable. But I also think it's unacceptable that at no point in all of this had she clearly ever thought about talking to the victims of the Oldham rape gangs.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's very telling. Two things can be unacceptable at once.
Yeah. Well put. Okay, so the inquiry, we're due to have a vote. Kemi Badenoch's wanted to add in something that's going through this afternoon. She wants a debate. There's going to be a debate at 4 p.m, so those listening will have already known the outcome of it. But there's mixed reports. There's one report Keir Starmer is going to block the government inquiry, and there is also a report that Jess Phillips has said she's not ruling it out of the question. But why do you think Keir Starmer would want to block this?
Fascinating question. Absolutely fascinating question. So his excuse now is that we need to just get on with implementing the recommendations made by the J report and a couple of other reports as well, and that this would potentially block that. That is rubbish. So that excuse is rubbish, because you can get on with implementing the recommendations that have already been outlined. And what you can do in this report is make sure that the full singular focus is on Pakistani rape gangs, and that everyone who was involved in covering this stuff up is named and shamed. Just quickly, before I return to Keir Starmer, there was a thing that was doing the rounds last night about there was a 15-year-old girl, I think in the Oldham area, who was arrested for prostitution. And then the magistrate who sentenced her was the man who had solicited her for prostitution. So this is the kind of stuff, this is the kind of stuff that needs to be given more attention, and that the individuals involved here can be specifically named and shamed, and the cover-up can be revealed. Now on that word cover-up, Keir Starmer. So, he was head of the DPP. Now, it's absolutely fair and right to say that he did do some...
Director of the CPA.
Sorry, Director of Public Prosecutions, So it's right and fair to say that he did do some work on this, and did do some good work on it. And that's okay. But if he wants to claim responsibility for everything that he got right and every single conviction that there was when it came to grooming gangs, then I'm afraid he also has to claim responsibility for the things that they didn't do right and the things that they got wrong. And there were cases... where, for example, in Rochdale or Rotherham, there was a girl who was in a kebab shop kicking off, believed to be intoxicated. And the police came, and the police said, well, they arrested her initially for being drunk and disorderly. And she went to that police station and she said, the man at this kebab shop have raped me. And she provided the police with her underwear. And that underwear had the DNA of at least one of those men in it. And this was presented to the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, which Keir Starmer was ultimately head of. And there was a decision made that no further action would be taken because she was deemed to not be a reliable witness because of her background, presumably, and her drink and possibly drug use from a young age. And
sorry, what year was this?
That would have... I'll double check. I don't want to get this wrong because it is an important issue. I will double check it. And... the decision was made not to prosecute, and then years later, like say 4 or 5 years later, those men then actually were found guilty of this. So there was an initial decision not to charge, and then eventually,
how much can that really be put at Starmer's feet?
Well,
would he even have seen that case?
Well, he would probably say that he hasn't. I think you should maybe take a keen interest, shouldn't you? Should you not be taking a keen interest? If you think that if you are so aware of there being an issue to the extent where you do good work around Rochdale or Rotherham at times, should you not maybe take a keener interest in it? The other key thing is, there's a video of this. He's sat in front of an inquiry, and he says that there were problems when you are weighing up whether or not to bring someone to court, to charge someone for something. You do have to look at the reliability of victims, and certainly when it comes to sexual assault. And some of the criteria involved in that has the alleged victim repeatedly gone back to their alleged attacker or abuser? Do they have drink or drug problems? Do they have mental health problems? Have they maybe been turning up every single time the police have asked to do an interview with them, etc.? But those criteria do not really apply to 12, 13 and 14-year-old girls who are being plied with drink and drugs by their grooming gangs, who are maybe in care homes and who are being picked up in taxis by these grooming gangs. So they are repeatedly going back to them. They are, quotes unquote, unreliable witnesses. That's not a reason to discard them. That's a reason to do something about that. Now, look, I don't want to be unnecessarily unfair to Keir Starmer, because he had a massive job there. He had a massive job, and you will find hundreds of people who worked with him over that time who say he was great at that job. And it's a massive issue. It's probably the biggest issue maybe for you and I, but this would have been one thing in his in tray. And I am sympathetic towards that. What I am more bothered about with Keir Starmer is the language he's used since. Again, now he's Prime Minister. If he's so sure of his record, if he is absolutely adamant that when he was the Director of Public Prosecutions, he did everything he could and he changed the game and he moved things forward and he got justice for people, then why wouldn't he just welcome an inquiry? Why wouldn't you welcome a full-blown, no-holds-barred inquiry? I do think that it's reasonable to suspect that he's concerned about what that might unearth. And that would be my view, yeah.
There was an investigation by Guy Adams published last year and for the Mail, and this is the best evidence I found of Starmer's complicity. And Adams wrote that Starmer was in 21 meetings with the Sentencing Council to decide that not all child sex offenders should go to prison. And in Adams's report, I'll quote it, the crimes that were looked at during this review ranged from rape and sexual assault to prostitution, grooming, sex trafficking, voyeurism, exposure, and child pornography. Eventually, the council decided that 20 of these crimes could, in certain circumstances, be punished via community orders rather than prison sentences. That number included a total of 8 offences where the principal victim is a child. They range from sexual assault of a child under 13, possession of an indecent photograph of a child, paying for sexual services of a child, and arranging or facilitating the sexual exploitation of a child. Adams goes on to report that there is no evidence that Starmer protested against any of this. So that seems to me to be the best evidence I've found of any immediate complicity. Is there anything else you think I'm missing on Starmer?
I don't think there's necessarily anything else that you're missing other than a mindset thing. I mean, that to me points towards a certain mindset, doesn't it? And again, it's about the gravity of this issue. So, we have had inquiries into things like the infected blood scandal. We have had the post office scandal. And by the way, rightly so. Fine, great. Starmer was very vocal about this scandal of the waspy women and everything, which is a problem. But he was on the inside of this, and if it is the case, which I firmly believe it is, that there are 50 towns and cities across the country, at least, where there was a conveyor belt of child abuse being committed by predominantly British Pakistani men, he will have seen the scale of this. And how can you not think that is one of the most pressing issues on your intro, especially when you factor in the continued level of rapid immigration from countries like Pakistan into these areas. And that, to me, would imply that problem is going to get worse, not better, if you don't do something about it. So, he, again, will vociferously say he's not complicit in it. It's a question of whether or not you've done everything that you possibly could. And this inquiry that we could have now, specifically into Pakistani rape gangs, would include a huge chunk of time when he was Director of Public Prosecutions. And again, you factor that in, you factor in the fact that it took place almost exclusively in Labour areas, Labour councils, with Labour MPs and with Labour councillors. Is it really in this government's interest to do it? The other thing I will say, though, is that it's all very well and good the Tories talking about it now and Kemi Bain not talking about it now. And I'm glad that they are. And I'm glad that they're putting this towards Parliament as we speak right now. I really am glad. But they had 14 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
To do a number on it. They did.
That was actually my next question. I would say it's not entirely one note on Labour. I was very happy and pleased to see that Lord Maurice Glassman, founder of Blue Labour, has very much stood up against what the rest of the Labour Party are doing and saying there needs to be an inquiry. But the Conservatives, they've had power for 14 years. Kemi Badenoch was in the cabinet. She's now calling for an inquiry. I agree with you that there should be one. I also agree that what we really need is action and justice. Yeah. But I think that would start with an inquiry. How much do you think the Tories do you sort of as angry at the Tories as you are at Labour?
I'm unbelievably angry with the Conservative Party about a whole host of things. It's very easy. It's too easy to hark back and go, "Oh, Tony Blair opened the floodgates into Britain." All that. Okay, well, he might have done, but then the Tories did have a 14-year period. And when you look now at the state of towns and cities across this country, well, the Conservatives did that on their watch. And the economic case for mass immigration has been shattered because we are worse off per capita. And we have a housing crisis, and we have a problem getting to see GPs and hospital appointments, and we don't have enough school places for people, and we don't have this. And they oversaw all of that. And I thought with Conservatives, the clue was in the name. Aren't you supposed to conserve something? Aren't you supposed to conserve Britain? And if you look around now and you go right across the UK, what has been conserved? They were as guilty as it is possible to be about completely destroying British national identity, British culture, British way of life, community. They were completely as guilty of that as anyone. Boris Johnson's a great example of this. I like Boris. I interviewed him on GB News. He's quite difficult not to like as a bloke. He's got a twinkle in the eye that makes you want to go on a 3-day bender with him. And that's fantastic, right? But he obviously he's mainlining mass migration.
Well, the famous Boris way.
And then pisses off to the Cotswolds. Goes and lives in an area with pretty much no immigration. Goes and lives in an area where if he just wanders around, it was almost certain he will never see anything other than a white face, right? But then pumps Britain full of, and it's not about the colour of people's skin. It's a culture thing, and it's a lack of community, and it's a numbers game as well. Pumps us full of that. And so the Conservatives are as guilty as that as anyone. And that's going to be a massive issue for them. In fact, Nigel Farage tweeted, I saw this just as I came into your studio today, so I will read this out, actually, because he tweeted that Kemi Badenoch, for all of her talk now about bringing this inquiry in, I'll read you this exact tweet now. He says, Kemi Badenoch was Minister for Women and Equalities from 2022 to 2024. Why did she not demand a full inquiry then? Well, why not? Robert Jenrick.
There was a task force in 2023 that Rishi headed up. I'm not quite sure what the good it did, or what results came from it.
No.
Yeah.
So I'm not either, but that says a lot, though, doesn't it? Really, that. But just to come back, I do think the Conservatives really have a huge amount of time to fall now, and I think that is why. Well, I know it's why, really, we're seeing a huge increase in popularity for Nigel Farage and for Reform and for people like Rupert Lowe. We've got clean hands when it comes to this kind of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think we've missed in all of this? It's people listening who really know this topic are going to be frustrated because, as I said at the beginning, it's so multifaceted and there's so many dynamics at play. I could have done a whole thing just on Elon Musk, really, and why he's tweeting about it, whether it's because of his grandma being a working class girl from Liverpool. And there's a whole story there, and there's the police, there's local councils, there's judiciary, the bits that we haven't got into. It can't be done in one episode. And Tommy Robinson, of course, could be a 6-part series. Is there, for now, is there anything you think that's important?
I think there's loads to this, right? So we are focusing in, rightly so, on Pakistani rape gangs. But what were they also doing? Well, they were involved in the drugs trade in the local area. And the Rochdale, there's been a whole documentary series on Asian drug gangs in Rochdale. I went to Telford in the wake of the expose on that. And it is absolutely clear to me that some of the same people who were involved in the grooming gangs issue there were also involved in, I would argue, quite large-scale money laundering operations. I mean, there's some unbelievably large business premises there that never seem to have anybody going into them. So this is a huge mafia-style crime network. A part of that, a big part of that, is the industrial-level rape of young white girls, which is like just as bad as it gets. But you've got also all of this. You've got the drugs trade. You've got, I think, fraud as well going on. And it's happening right across the place. I would also say this as well, in terms of a point that we've missed, is how we deal about it now. Why are we not having more of a conversation about deporting these people? If they've got a dual passport with Pakistan and the UK, we need to get them out of Britain. And when I was in Telford, I was stood outside a shopping centre interviewing one of the victims, and her attacker walked past her. So he'd been to prison, he'd come out of prison, and he'd moved back in to where he was from, and he walked past her. There's a guy called Quarry Ralph, who's in Rochdale at the moment, now works as a food delivery driver. So conceivably, in the area that he was raping girls in, so conceivably, one of his victims could order a pizza, and her abuser knocks on the door to deliver it to her. Why are we allowing that to happen? He was scheduled for deportation 11 years ago. Why is Britain not putting leverage on countries like Pakistan? We give them a lot in foreign aid. It's one of those countries that needs us more than we need them. Could this not be a line in the sand for a future trade deal? What do you think Donald Trump will be doing about this now? If this was an issue that was brought to his attention right now, he'd be straight there, talking about, well, your trade deal and whatever financial incentives that you make out of my great country are going to hinge on whether or not you take these monsters back and you bring them to justice in your country. So we have been soft on this. We're not doing anything about it now. The question of deportation needs to be front and centre.
Yeah, so let's talk about deportation, because there's some people talking about solutions. You mentioned this. Certainly the Reform MPs are talking about this quite openly and unapologetically. I would say that there's also a lot of discourse, and I would probably identify most of it with the far right, about remigration, not just deporting criminals, violent criminals, and these perpetrators in the rape gangs, but also whole communities. Let's say it's a whole certain culture that hasn't integrated like other cultures have. And I would say that seems extremely drastic and unnecessary, because we haven't even tried proper law and order. We haven't actually punished these people. If there was a proper system, in fact, not only have we not punished them, the current system incentivizes that they target young white girls, because there's different punishments depending on the different ethnicities. So the punishment is worse if you were to go after a Pakistani young child than it is.
Can you imagine the uproar on that, by the way? Just quickly, because I think it's a really good point, this remigration topic. But can you imagine what would be happening on the streets of Britain right now if it was emerging that tens or hundreds of thousands of young British Pakistani girls had been raped for decades by white taxi drivers or white restaurant owners, and it was could you imagine what we would be looking at right now on the streets? So I think it's an interesting contrast there on this remigration stuff. Just practically speaking, I'm not really sure. Morally and practically speaking, I'm not really sure how it works. So you can't just round up half of Oldham. Well, you can't.
And many of them are British citizens without dual nationality. So that for me is fascism. If you're
it would be. I mean, you would just be rounding up people with a brown face and putting them on a plane back to a country that maybe they'd never been to,
and they might well have been here for 2 or 3 generations.
So you can't do that. I really it's important that you and I and other allies, we have the kind of open discussions and at times very strong kind of conversations that might make people wince, right? But it's really important that we don't ever seem to be quivering on the idea of let's just deport a lot of them. Because that's ridiculous.
Well, that conversation is being had. But when it comes to violent criminals, I mean, when I hear about some of these paedophile stories, if you read the transcripts, frankly, I'm like, bring the death penalty back on these things.
Castrate them, do it all.
Yeah. So it doesn't seem drastic to me, but there is definitely a line there, and then there's a big line, and I would say that a lot of this is very anti-Islam, or rather anti-Muslim, and so then that's where we're seeing this great division between British Muslims and British non-Muslims. And if you go down the rabbit hole of their different Twitter feeds, you see that they're getting very different pictures. So there's I guess other dynamics that are unnerving.
This is a great conversation. So the same could apply when it comes to Islamist terrorism. So I mean, a good example would be the Manchester Arena bombing. Again, I'm from near that neck of the woods. I'd been in that arena many times. Saw my first ever concert there. It was Steps, actually, so don't judge me, but that was my first ever concert. I know.
We'll cut that out later.
I know, yeah, good. But so I felt that particular attack very, very deeply. And I was quite surprised at how quickly the elders of the mosque that the attacker Salman Abedi had been going to were out on the steps of that mosque. I remember we were told they're going to do a press conference, and I was working at a newspaper at the time, so I was watching it, and there didn't appear to be too much contrition. It was more it was that thing of seriously, don't blame all Muslims for this. And yeah, but absolutely, we shouldn't be blaming all Muslims for this. But I wonder at times if ordinary, hardworking, law-abiding members of the British Muslim community have said or done everything that they possibly could to, how do I phrase this? To clamp down within their own community on certain radical aspects of it, be that grooming gangs or be that extremism. Now they will argue, and I have sympathy for this, that that's not their place to do that. They don't have to justify the actions of wrongers in the same way that I don't feel I have to justify the actions of Jimmy Savile, and I'm sure you don't either. Absolutely fine. But if
as a Christian, when I hear of stuff going on in the church, with paedophile stuff in the church, I'm like, this is not in the name of Christ. I'm disgusted by that stuff, and certainly whenever it comes up, I'm like, absolutely not. This is not what Christianity is about.
And when I look at people like that guy I mentioned there in Rochdale, Corey Ralph, who is clearly back in the family home and has got a very nice life in Britain and appears to be back in with the community, that's what I'm talking about. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Why has that been allowed to happen? And that, I find that troubling. And if I was just an ordinary member of the local Muslim community, I'd be fuming about that. How? That is an open goal for people who want to say that, who want to just, throw a blanket over all Muslims. That is an open goal for it. And look, again, I will emphasise, because it's a difficult thing to talk about, it's a difficult thing to phrase correctly. I do not feel that all Muslims in Britain need to justify the actions of the wrongers. I'm not saying that, but I do wonder at times if enough is done in those communities. I do wonder that.
Well, Patrick, we've covered a lot, but we've only covered a fraction of it all. So maybe it's something we'll discuss another time. I say thank you so much for your time. And where can people find you?
Well, so I'm on Twitter. It's at Patrick Christys, the same on Instagram, I think. And crucially, GB News, 9 to 11 p.m, Monday to Friday. So, yes, thank you very much. And thank you for appearing on my show regularly as well.
I'm always thrilled to be invited. I think you write fantastic monologues. I think you're very courageous as a broadcaster. I watch you regularly, and I think it's very impressive what you do. Thank you. I know your schedule is unbelievably busy. I hope we can do this again, and I'm sure there'll be lots of opinions on all the things we got wrong in that, and I'm open to hearing them, because I think this is, as we've discussed, the worst thing to happen to our country. Well, it's the worst thing happening in our country in our lifetime. So anyway, thank you so much for courageously speaking.
Thank you, mate. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you for watching The Winston Marshall Show. That was Patrick Christys. If you want to support this show, all you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Patrick discussing the issues that you want to hear about and the mainstream media won't touch. If you want exclusive content, head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk. But until next time, be well.